Hello and welcome to this podcast, which is part of a series called Inventing Embodiment. My name is Jonathan Burrows. I'm a choreographer and also a faculty member at the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry University. Last year, my colleagues at CDER met online once a week to talk, and the conversation kept coming back to the question of how we speak about embodiment. This podcast aims to capture some of the research I was fortunate to hear then. My guest this morning is Sarah Whatley, who is the director of the Centre for Dance Research, as well as being a former dancer and now a dance researcher, thinker and writer. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's very nice to be here.
I know you've been very busy recently with stuff to do with running a department and so forth, but I wanted to start by asking you, is there research that's interesting you at the moment that you're maybe longing to launch into or to pick up from before, and can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, there's lots of research that I'm keen to get back into. Perhaps I should talk about one strand of my research that I've been involved in for many years, but I'm getting more involved in it recently, which is the intersection between dance, disability and digital technologies. I've been working for many years with and in collaboration with dancers with disabilities. And more recently, I've become much more interested in how their work within digital environments and working with different digital technologies opens up some very interesting questions about how those technological processes, those digital processes, can assume that we all have the same body and that there are values and properties around those digital processes that are normative. In other words, they sort of assume that bodies are neutral entities. And what's so interesting is when dancers with different physicalities, different bodies enter those environments, it does open up all sorts of questions about how we need to rethink some of those principles and some of those values, because their knowledge, their expertise, their understanding about how their particular body moves is really important for then trying always to keep agitating about these assumptions that bodies are somehow all formed the same way, all move the same way. And the expertise they bring, I think, is really valuable for moving those conversations on.
Can you give me an example of a kind of normative use of digital technology in terms of the body?
Yes. Some time ago, and unfortunately it is some time ago now because we haven't been able to get back into the studio recently, we were working with dancers with different disabilities, a dancer who is an amputee, actually two dancers who are amputees, one of whom dances with sometimes with a crutch, the other dancer who never dances with a crutch or a prosthetic, but who does use a prosthetic outside of her dancing life. And we were working in the studio with motion capture technology. And of course, motion capture technology, there are different systems at play, but we were using a system whereby the dancers wear a bodysuit and there are sensors on those bodysuits. And of course, the suits are designed for bodies that have 4 limbs, and the sensors are then marked on the body to track movement in all of those limbs. So of course it opens up some really interesting questions about then how is movement tracked when the body itself is quite different, and if you like the normative assumption that a moving body is a body with 4 limbs is different. We had some really interesting conversations about that. There were some amusing times as well as what do you do with the suit or the leg of the suit which doesn't have a leg to fill it and then where are the important or interesting places on those bodies to place the markers so that the tracking of those individual dancers is as true as it can be to the particular ways in which those bodies move, those dancers move. And what tends to happen often with those digital processes is because it is a system of processing data, that data itself can become how might I say, sort of neutralized in the process because of its necessity for taking it through those different rendering processes. So sometimes you can lose the specificity of those individual bodies, and what makes those particular dancers, what makes their movement very particular and individual to them.
Do you think this critique of the digital as carrying a very normative kind of embodiment could also be said of contemporary dance in general? Is the embodiment that contemporary dance talks about too specific to particular kinds of, for instance, young, highly trained bodies and so forth?
I think we've moved a long way. I think thankfully we're recognising now that there are different ways in which dancers can develop and be trained and find their own particular idiosyncratic ways of moving that are true to their own interests and curiosities about what they want to say in their dance and so on. But yes, I think there is still a hangover of something of a sort of an essentialist view about what a training should be, and therefore what dancers should aspire to be. And that there is a sort of perhaps a singular idea of embodiment, that one aspires to be a particular kind of dancer, in an aspiring and achieving that you reach some sort of normative sense of embodiment. I think things have moved on, and I think that there's recognition that there are, if you like, many ways in which embodiment can be experienced and recognised and understood. But there's also something I've noticed is the sense that there are some pathways to that can claim a more sort of more superior way of achieving embodiment. So one sort of needs to follow a particular pathway to become embodied in a particular way. And I think that's when it's less wholesome, let's say. And that I think the diversity in our dance sector is really, really important. So we need to acknowledge that there are different pathways to dancing excellence, if you like, and a part of that excellence is about individual embodiment.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things for myself personally, I've gotten out of doing these podcasts. The first was hearing Emma Meehan talk about the idea of embodiment in relation to long-term pain or residual pain in the body. And the other was Kate Marsh making the provocation that people with disability do embodiment better because of the way in which they're required to constantly negotiate their own bodies within contexts and environments that are not prepared for them. And it's made me reflect a lot in my own practice. I mean, for instance, I have dancers' injuries and I have arthritis and things coming at you essentially from a long practice as a dancer. And I suddenly realized one day last week that the thing that I need to work on now is a kind of disembodying, which releases the awareness of those residual problems and so forth. And so that's made me question a little bit, because at the same time, I don't think there's a dancer in the world that doesn't at some level hold on to these much more normative ideas of embodiment that were trained into them at an early age.
Yes, I think that's a really good observation. And as you say, as some of us age and some of those awarenesses of our body not quite performing or moving in the way that it once did, it does draw our attention to rethinking some of those assumptions that we perhaps have had for many, many years about how we train, how we perform, how we make dance. And that, as you mentioned through Kate's recognition of dancers with disabilities, all the time they are negotiating their way through these sort of normative situations, which I think infuse so much of, all working worlds, all working environments, and the dancers' working environment in particular, everything from the training experience, the way the studio is set up, the way rehearsals are timed, the way schedules are formed, all of those processes have a sort of normative structure around them, which is why also, not wishing to dwell on the pandemic, but I think it has sort of brought to our attention many ways in which those structures have had to shift, have had to change. And for some, that's been really beneficial because structures that were inaccessible before have become accessible. But on the other hand, because we have lost those physical connections and those chances to be, in a way, in negotiation with others about how we think about our own bodies moving through the world, moving in relation to the environment, moving in relation to each other, that we somehow lost something of that connection of our body's intelligence, our body's wisdom, in a way. So there are all sorts of pressures and stresses and challenges that have helped us, I think, confront, sometimes not very pleasantly or comfortably, some of those assumptions around normative structures, normative values.
So at CDAY, you've brought together over the last few years an extraordinary group of dance thinkers and practitioners, and everyone in some way seems to be busy with different aspects of the idea of embodiment. And I just wondered how you feel about the fact that these viewpoints, in a way, are so disparate. I mean, I've called this podcast series Inventing Embodiment to reflect the fact that, for me, I celebrate that there's no singular image of embodiment. Is that something that you celebrate, or do you think that we should be moving towards something that clarifies a more singular image of embodiment?
I definitely celebrate diversity. I definitely celebrate the idea that everybody brings a wealth of different experiences, understandings, questions, curiosities about the question of embodiment and many other questions. I think it would be wrong to try to move towards a singular understanding or definition. I'm aware that, in a way, we all talk about being embodied. We all have our own sort of unspoken tacit understanding about what we mean when we talk about embodiment. You know, it's something that I think dancers do well, if that's the right way of putting it, with many of our experiences, because we are so committed to and so immersed in our training experiences, in our development through our way into dance. You know, for those of us who've been dancing for years and years and years, we sort of build up this body knowledge, and we're acutely aware of how we move through the world, and perhaps more aware than many others, you know, in terms of how all sorts of aspects of how we experience weight, gravity, coordination, balance, all of those other properties of dance, all of which sort of collectively produce this sense of us understanding embodiment. And so we sort of nod to each other in that rather sort of sagely way of saying, yes, we understand what embodiment is. And we keep, I think, striving in a way to keep sort of in touch with those questions around embodiment. But I think it's in those conversations and in those discussions, and perhaps in some of the contradictions that come out in that conversation and understanding of embodiment becomes richer and fuller, without it becoming singular. So no, I would not support the idea that we come up with a sort of ultimate definition of embodiment.
And last question, are there kind of markers, obvious markers, for the ways in which this larger research and thinking around embodiment might or could impact more widely within society? What would your fantasy be towards that?
I suppose one of my missions, if that's not too strong a word, has been to always remind colleagues in other disciplinary fields and so on how important it is to bring knowledge of the body, the moving body, awareness of the moving body, and respect for the moving body into so many other conversations and fields of research, and how if we neglect that at our peril. And it's so important that those awarenesses and conversations around the knowledge and the wisdom of the moving body, how it can inform, how it can support, how it can enrich many, many other areas. So I think it's so important. And, you know, one of my wishes was that every student in every course, from young through school, through university and so on, they begin the day moving together. And I've experienced that myself with various research projects, working with experts who are coming from widely varied other disciplinary fields, who the thought of moving together in a space that's called, a dance studio or a space for dance, very anxious at first. But through that moving together and through that sort of coming to a greater awareness of their own capacity and potential for movement, gain such an insight to the wisdom of their own movement and their own body and its potential, and how that has then gone back into enrich their own disciplinary work, which may be a long way away from dance, but it has such a benefit for them bringing their bodily knowledge into that work that they're doing elsewhere. And I think it would be such a valuable process for everybody to go through, to just spend some time moving and having a chance to experience and reflect on and share being embodied, bringing our attention to how we are feeling and moving and being.
That feels like a good place to pause. Thanks so much, Sarah, for sharing those thoughts with us today.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.